How did a small city on the banks of the Tiber rise to control a vast empire? And why did that empire eventually fall? From a struggling republic to the most powerful force in the ancient Mediterranean, Rome's story is one of ambition, conquest, triumph, and ultimately collapse. A city that became a Mediterranean superpower. More than 2,000 years ago, a city stood beside the Tiber River. It was not yet the capital of an empire stretching across continents. It was not yet the center of the Mediterranean world. It was simply Rome. For centuries, Rome grew through war, diplomacy, alliances, and political transformation. Its armies fought neighboring peoples. Its citizens struggled over political power. Its leaders competed for influence. And with every victory, Rome's world became larger. But Rome's rise was not simply a story of military conquest. The Romans developed a political system capable of mobilizing enormous resources. They created alliances with communities across Italy. They expanded citizenship in different forms. And they built a military system that could recover from devastating defeats. Then Rome encountered its greatest rival, Carthage. For generations, the two powers competed for influence across the Mediterranean. Their struggle would produce some of the most famous wars of the ancient world. Hannibal would cross the Alps. Roman armies would suffer catastrophic defeats. And yet, Rome would survive. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Carthage had been destroyed, and Rome had emerged as the dominant power in the Mediterranean. But this was only the beginning. The republic that conquered the Mediterranean would eventually be transformed by the very power it had created. Its victories would bring enormous wealth. Its expansion would create new political tensions. And eventually, the Republic would collapse. From that collapse would emerge the Roman Empire. This is the story of how Rome rose from a city on the Tiber to become one of the most powerful states of the ancient world. And to understand that rise, we must begin with the land itself. How Rome rose. Chapter 1. The Birth of Rome. The land of Italy. To understand Rome, we must first understand Italy. The Italian peninsula stretches deep into the Mediterranean Sea. To the north, the Alps form a natural barrier between Italy and much of continental Europe. Running down the center of the peninsula are the Apennine Mountains. Between mountains, rivers, valleys, and plains, countless communities developed their own languages, cultures, and political traditions. Italy was never a single unified country in the early history of Rome. It was a world of different peoples. Among them were the Etruscans in central and northern Italy, Greek communities in the south, and numerous Italic peoples spread across the peninsula. Rome emerged in the central Italian region of Latium. The city developed beside the Tiber River, not far from the western coast. The river provided a natural route for movement and trade. The surrounding hills offered defensible positions, and Rome's location placed it within a landscape where different peoples and cultures met. But geography alone does not explain Rome's future. Other cities occupied important positions. Other peoples had powerful armies, and Rome was initially only one community among many. Its transformation into a major power would depend on what its people did with the opportunities and dangers created by their environment.
The founding of Rome.
Every great civilization creates stories about its beginnings. Rome was no different. According to Roman tradition, the city's origins were connected to two brothers, Romulus and Remus. The story says that the twins were abandoned as infants and survived after being cared for by a she-wolf. When they grew older, they became involved in a struggle over where a new city should be founded. The brothers eventually became enemies. Romulus killed Remus. And according to the legend, Romulus became the founder and first king of Rome.
Roman tradition placed this foundation in the 8th century BCE. But the archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story. There was no single moment when Rome suddenly appeared. Communities had already occupied the hills around the future city. Over time, settlements grew closer together. People interacted. Political structures developed, and separate communities gradually became part of a larger urban center. The legend of Romulus may have been created or developed to explain this transformation through the story of a single founder. The historical reality was probably much slower. Rome was built over generations, and its early development was shaped not by one man alone, but by the interaction of many communities living in central Italy. The story of Romulus and Remus would nevertheless remain powerful. For Romans, it provided a beginning, and every great power needs a story about where it came from. From village to city.
Rome did not become powerful overnight. It grew. The settlements scattered across the hills gradually became part of a larger community. The process was shaped by geography, trade, conflict, and cultural exchange. Rome's neighbors included the Etruscans to the north and other Italic peoples throughout central Italy. Greek communities had also established colonies in southern Italy, bringing the wider Mediterranean world into contact with the Italian peninsula. Rome stood at the crossroads of these influences. Ideas, technologies, religious practices, and artistic traditions moved between communities. The early Romans were not isolated from the world around them.
They were part of it. According to Roman tradition, the city was once ruled by kings. Later Roman writers described a succession of 7 kings, although the historical details of this period are difficult to verify. Archaeology, however, provides evidence for increasing urban development during the early centuries of Rome. Public spaces emerged. Infrastructure improved. The settlement became more organized, and Rome increasingly resembled a city rather than a collection of villages. But the Roman state that would eventually dominate the Mediterranean had not yet been created. That transformation would come with a political revolution. According to Roman tradition, the monarchy was overthrown.
and a new system of government was born: the Roman Republic.
Chapter 2: The Roman Republic. The fall of the kings. According to Roman tradition, the beginning of the Republic came through revolution. For generations, Rome had been ruled by kings. But the final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, was remembered by later Romans as a cruel and oppressive ruler. Roman tradition tells the story of a noblewoman named Lucretia. According to the legend, Lucretia was assaulted by Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son. After revealing what had happened to her family, Lucretia took her own life. Her death became the spark for rebellion. Led by figures including Lucius Junius Brutus, the Romans rose against the monarchy. The king was expelled, and the Roman Republic was born. The traditional date was 509 BCE, but historians must be cautious. The story of Lucretia was recorded centuries after the supposed events, and some of its details may have been shaped by Roman ideas about honor, tyranny, and political freedom. What seems more certain is that Rome eventually abandoned kingship and developed a new political system. Power would no longer officially belong to a single hereditary king. Instead, Rome would be governed through a complex system of magistrates, assemblies, and the Senate. The Republic had begun. But it was not a democracy in the modern sense. Political power remained concentrated among powerful families, and ordinary Romans would spend generations fighting for greater political rights. The struggle over who should rule Rome was only beginning. The Senate and the people.
The Roman Republic was built on a simple principle. No single king would rule Rome again. Instead, power would be divided among institutions and elected officials. At the center of Roman political life stood the Senate. Its members were drawn primarily from Rome's elite families, and although the Senate's formal powers changed over time, its influence was enormous. Alongside the Senate were magistrates elected to hold public office. Among the most important were the two consuls. Each year, two consuls were elected. They commanded armies. They presided over important political affairs, and they could act as a check on one another's power. But Rome was not a democracy in the modern sense.
Political influence was heavily concentrated among wealthy and powerful families. Ordinary citizens had fewer political advantages, and this created a conflict that would shape Roman history for generations. The struggle was between the patricians, members of Rome's traditional aristocratic elite, and the plebeians, the broader body of Roman citizens. The plebeians wanted greater political protection and influence. Their struggle would eventually lead to important reforms. The creation of the office of tribune of the plebs gave ordinary citizens representatives who could defend their interests. Over time, Roman political institutions became more complex. The Republic was not a system created once and then left unchanged. It evolved through conflict. And the political struggles inside Rome would become one of the forces that shaped its extraordinary expansion. The meaning of citizenship.
Rome's power
did not depend only on its armies. It also depended on an idea that would become one of the most important forces in Roman history: citizenship. To be a Roman citizen was to possess a legal and political status that carried important rights and responsibilities. But Roman citizenship was not distributed equally across the Mediterranean. As Rome expanded, it developed different relationships with the communities it conquered or allied with. Some people received Roman citizenship. Others received limited forms of citizenship. Some communities retained their own local governments while remaining allies of Rome. This system was complicated, but it gave Rome an advantage. Instead of simply destroying every community it defeated, Rome could incorporate some populations into a wider political and military network. Allies could provide soldiers. Citizens could serve in Roman armies. Communities could benefit from Roman protection. And Rome could gradually expand its influence without governing every person in exactly the same way. This flexibility helped Rome dominate Italy, but it also created tensions. Not everyone who fought alongside Rome enjoyed the same rights as Roman citizens. Over time, these inequalities would produce demands for greater political inclusion. For now, however, Rome had developed a powerful combination: military force, political institutions, and a system capable of binding different communities to the Roman state. The city on the Tiber was becoming something much larger, and soon Rome would turn its attention beyond the Italian peninsula. Chapter 3: The Conquest of Italy. Rome goes to war. The Roman Republic was born in a world where conflict was never far away. Across Italy, communities competed for land, resources, trade routes, and influence. Rome was no exception. In the early centuries of the Republic, Roman armies fought neighboring peoples across central Italy. The Romans faced the Volscians and Aequi. They fought the Etruscan cities to the north, and they repeatedly came into conflict with communities that resisted Roman expansion. These wars were not always campaigns of conquest in the modern sense. Sometimes Rome fought to defend its territory. Sometimes it sought greater influence. And sometimes the outcome was shaped by alliances and negotiations as much as by military force. But each conflict brought experience. The Romans developed institutions capable of repeatedly raising armies. Citizens could be called to military service. Commanders gained experience. And communities that had once been enemies could eventually become allies. Rome also learned an important lesson. Victory on the battlefield was only the beginning. To maintain its influence, Rome needed to control territory, secure roads, establish alliances, and prevent defeated enemies from immediately turning against it. This combination of military strength and political organization would become one of Rome's greatest advantages. But Rome's expansion was not easy. One of its most dangerous enemies would be the Etruscan city of Veii. The struggle against Veii would become a turning point in Rome's rise. The Italian Peninsula. Rome's greatest challenge was not simply defeating one enemy,
It was surviving in a world filled with powerful rivals. One of Rome's most important early conflicts was the long struggle against Veii, an influential Etruscan city located only a short distance north of Rome. According to Roman tradition, the conflict lasted for years. Eventually, Rome captured Veii. The victory gave Rome control over valuable territory and strengthened its position in central Italy. But soon, disaster struck. Around the beginning of the 4th century BCE, a Gallic force invaded Italy and defeated the Romans. The Gauls entered Rome and famously sacked the city. The event became one of the great traumas of Roman memory.
Rome had survived, but it had learned how vulnerable it could be. The Romans rebuilt, and they continued expanding. Their next major challenge came from the Samnites, powerful peoples who controlled much of the rugged interior of central and southern Italy. The Samnite wars lasted for decades. Rome suffered defeats. It faced difficult terrain, and at times its armies were forced into humiliating situations. But Rome repeatedly recovered. By the end of the conflict, Roman influence had spread deep into the Italian peninsula. The Romans had defeated or subdued many of their major rivals. Yet southern Italy presented a new challenge. There, Greek cities had existed for centuries, and one of the most powerful rulers in the region was about to enter the struggle. His name was Pyrrhus, and his war against Rome would give history a phrase that is still used today: a Pyrrhic victory. The Roman alliance system. Rome's greatest weapon was not always its sword. It was its ability to turn enemies into allies. As Rome expanded across Italy, it developed a complex network of relationships. Some communities received Roman citizenship. Others were granted different legal statuses. Some retained their own local governments while becoming Rome's allies. And in strategic locations, Rome established colonies that strengthened its control over newly acquired territory. These arrangements were not always generous. Rome expected its allies to provide soldiers. Communities could be required to contribute troops to Roman campaigns. But in return, many received protection and access to the growing Roman political and economic system. The result was a remarkable military network.
When Rome went to war, it could draw upon manpower from across Italy. This gave the Republic an enormous advantage. A Roman defeat did not necessarily destroy the Roman military system. Even after suffering catastrophic losses, Rome could raise new armies from its citizens and allies. The system also helped Rome prevent conquered communities from forming a united front against it. Not every Italian community accepted Roman power willingly. Some resisted for generations. But gradually, Rome created a political network that connected much of the peninsula. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had become the dominant power in Italy. But one of its greatest tests was still ahead. In the Greek city of Tarentum, a powerful ruler from across the Adriatic was preparing to challenge Rome. His name was Pyrrhus of Epirus, and the war that followed would push Rome into the wider Mediterranean world.
Chapter 4. Rome against Carthage.
The First Punic War.
By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had conquered most of the Italian peninsula. But beyond Italy lay a much larger world, the Mediterranean. And there, Rome encountered a power unlike any enemy it had faced before: Carthage. Founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers, Carthage had become one of the richest and most powerful cities in the Western Mediterranean. Its influence stretched across North Africa and into parts of Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily. Carthage possessed a powerful navy. Rome did not. When conflict erupted in Sicily, the two powers became drawn into a struggle that neither side initially expected to last so long. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE. For more than 2 decades, Rome and Carthage fought for control of Sicily. Rome faced a fundamental problem. Its armies were experienced on land.
But Carthage dominated the sea. The Romans responded by building a fleet. According to ancient accounts, they developed a boarding device known as the corvus. Instead of relying entirely on naval maneuvering, Roman soldiers could use the device to board enemy ships and turn sea battles into something closer to infantry combat. The war became extraordinarily costly. Both sides suffered enormous losses. Ships were destroyed, armies were defeated, and the conflict continued year after year. Eventually, Rome built another fleet. In 241 BCE, a Roman naval victory near the Aegean Islands forced Carthage to negotiate. The war was over. Rome had won. Sicily became Rome's first major overseas possession. The balance of power in the Western Mediterranean had changed. But Carthage had not been destroyed, and the rivalry between the two powers was far from over.
Hannibal crosses the Alps.
The First Punic War had ended, but Rome and Carthage remained rivals. In the years that followed, Carthage rebuilt its power. Its influence expanded in Spain. And there, a brilliant Carthaginian commander began preparing for a new war. His name was Hannibal Barca. In 218 BCE, the conflict began. Hannibal chose a strategy that shocked Rome. Instead of waiting for Roman armies to attack Carthaginian territory, he would bring the war directly into Italy.
His army marched north through Spain and southern Gaul. Then came the greatest challenge: the Alps. Hannibal's army attempted to cross the mountains with soldiers, cavalry, supplies, and elephants. The journey was brutal. The army faced difficult terrain, cold weather, and attacks from local peoples. Many soldiers and animals were lost. But Hannibal survived the crossing. And suddenly, Rome faced an enemy army deep inside Italy. The Romans had expected to fight Carthage far from their homeland. Instead, the war had arrived at their doorstep. Hannibal would now begin a campaign that would produce some of Rome's most devastating military defeats.
Cannae. Hannibal had crossed the Alps.
Then he defeated Roman armies at the Trebia River, at Lake Trasimene. But Rome continued fighting. The Romans raised new armies, and in 216 BCE, They confronted Hannibal near the town of Cannae in southern Italy. The Roman army was enormous. Its commanders hoped that overwhelming numbers would finally destroy the Carthaginian army. Instead, Hannibal executed one of the most famous battlefield maneuvers in history. His center gradually gave ground. The Romans advanced. But as they moved forward, Carthaginian forces on the flanks attacked from both sides. Then Hannibal's cavalry returned from behind the Roman army. The Romans were surrounded. The battlefield became a disaster.
Thousands upon thousands of Roman soldiers were killed or captured. Cannae was one of the greatest military defeats in Roman history. For a moment, Rome seemed vulnerable. Some of its allies began to defect. Hannibal had demonstrated that Rome could be defeated, but he had not destroyed the Roman Republic. And this was the difference between Rome and many of its enemies. Rome refused to surrender. The Republic continued to raise armies. It continued to recruit soldiers. And it continued the war. Cannae had shown the world the brilliance of Hannibal's strategy, but it would also reveal something else: the extraordinary resilience of Rome.
Scipio strikes back. Cannae should have destroyed Rome, but Rome refused to collapse. The Republic changed its strategy. Rather than repeatedly confronting Hannibal in Italy, Roman commanders began to isolate him. They attacked Carthaginian allies. They strengthened their control over Italy. And a new Roman commander emerged: Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio understood that Rome could not defeat Hannibal simply by following him from battlefield to battlefield. Instead, he would take the war to Carthage itself. First, Scipio attacked Carthaginian power in Spain. His victories weakened Carthage and strengthened Rome. Then he moved his campaign into North Africa. Suddenly, Carthage itself was threatened. Hannibal was recalled from Italy. After years of fighting far from home, the great Carthaginian commander returned to defend his homeland.
The two armies met at Zama in 202 BCE. This time, Hannibal was defeated. The Second Punic War was over. Rome had survived its greatest military crisis, and Carthage had lost its position as a major Mediterranean power. Rome had learned a lesson that would shape its future. The Republic could endure catastrophic losses and continue fighting. Its enemies could win battles, but defeating Rome itself was another matter. The Mediterranean was now open to Roman expansion, and Rome was ready to take advantage of it.
The destruction of Carthage. The Second Punic War had ended. Hannibal was defeated. But Rome and Carthage continued to exist. For decades, Carthage remained a shadow of its former self. Rome, meanwhile, continued expanding. Across the eastern Mediterranean, Roman armies became involved in the affairs of Greek kingdoms. In the west, Roman influence continued to grow. And in the minds of some Roman politicians, Carthage remained a potential threat. One of the most famous voices demanding its destruction was Cato the Elder. His speeches were said to end with a warning: Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BCE, the final war began. The conflict was very different from the wars of Hannibal.
Carthage was now much weaker, but its people resisted. The Romans besieged the city for 3 years. Carthage fought desperately for survival. In 146 BCE, Roman forces finally broke through. The city was captured and destroyed. Its population suffered terrible consequences. Some were killed. Many survivors were enslaved. Carthage had ceased to exist as an independent power.
The greatest rival Rome had faced in the Western Mediterranean was gone. Rome was now the dominant power in the region. But victory had changed Rome. The Republic had become enormously wealthy and powerful. Its armies had conquered territories beyond Italy. Its citizens had access to new wealth and opportunities. But expansion also brought new problems. More land, more slaves, more wealth, more political competition. The victories that made Rome powerful would eventually create tensions that threatened the Republic itself. The city that had defeated Carthage was about to enter a new and dangerous chapter of its history.
Rome had begun as a city on the Tiber. For centuries, its power had been limited to the Italian peninsula. But generation after generation, the Romans fought, adapted, rebuilt, and expanded. They overthrew their kings. They created a republic. They conquered their neighbors. They survived invasions. They defeated the peoples of Italy. And then they faced the greatest rival they had ever known, Carthage. The wars between Rome and Carthage transformed the Mediterranean world. Rome had suffered devastating defeats.
At Cannae, an entire Roman army had been destroyed. But the Republic survived. It raised new armies, it rebuilt its strength, and eventually it defeated Hannibal. When Carthage was finally destroyed in 146 BCE, Rome stood as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. But victory came at a price. Rome was no longer the same republic that had once fought for survival in central Italy. Its territories had expanded enormously. Its armies had become more powerful. Its wealth had increased.
And vast numbers of enslaved people were brought into the Roman world. The spoils of conquest transformed the lives of some Romans, but they also widened divisions between the wealthy and the poor. Political competition became increasingly fierce. Powerful families fought for influence, and ambitious commanders discovered that military success could bring enormous political power. The Republic had conquered the Mediterranean. But could its political system survive the empire it had created? That question would define the next century of Roman history. The age of conquest had created a superpower. Now, Rome would have to confront the consequences of its own success. And the Republic was about to enter the most dangerous period of its history.